Hi everybody, I'm Jess Sinclair Taylor. I work for Feedback. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon to hear about our research on the Scottish salmon farming industry, focused in particular on the use of marine ingredients in salmon feed. Like I said, our findings in this research are specific to the Scottish salmon industry. However, our conclusions could be applied much more widely to other parts of the salmon farming industry. This webinar is going to last around 40 minutes, 45 minutes, with a bit of time for questions at the end. We suggest dropping your questions in the Q&A box as we go along, and if they're relevant to the piece of research that we're talking about at the moment, then we'll try and address them. Or if they're quite quick to address, we'll try and address them as we go. And then if they're a bit more complex, then we'll try and come to them at the end. So my colleague Karen will be keeping an eye on the Q&A box and interrupting us with some questions as we go along as needed. So let's get started. So some introductions. As I said, this webinar is based on research published in 2 reports a few weeks ago. They're on the screen and available on our website. And we're going to be going through a fair amount of content over the next half an hour or so, so we'll try and keep it to the point and coherent. For those of you who don't know, Feedback is an environmental campaign group, and we focus on the food system. We work to regenerate nature by transforming our food system. And the Feedback staff on this call is myself, I'm Jess. We have Karen, who's our head of research and the lead author of these reports, but we've cut her some slack. She's currently on sabbatical in northern Spain. So Christina, my colleague, and I will be doing most of the presentation. And so we've also got Christina, who's the campaign manager for this project. What we're going to cover in the webinar today is the sustainability challenge posed by the feed used to farm salmon, our modelling that we conducted, which addresses the tension between eating a healthy seafood diet and sustainability, the role of certification in managing the sustainability of aquaculture feed, and the question of equity, and in particular global equity, when it comes to accessing key micronutrients and aquaculture. And like I said earlier, for those who are just joining, if you have any questions, do feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to either address them as we go along or come to them at the end. Also, if you're planning to tweet, we encourage you to tweet. There's a hashtag off the menu. So let's get started. A quick overview of the aquaculture sector, sometimes known as the Blue Revolution. Aquaculture is the world's fastest growing food production sector. It's a huge growth industry globally. And the FAO, in fact, predicts that farmed seafood will account for 60% of global seafood consumption over the next decade. And aquaculture is often promoted and positioned as a sustainable solution to increasing demand and increasing pressure on the natural availability of wild seafood. However, for fed aquaculture, for aquaculture that requires feed inputs, and particularly for the farming of fish like salmon, aquaculture does lead us back to the seas and to their contents, because it relies on ingredients made from wild-caught fish in aquaculture feed. Salmon farming in Scotland is a relatively young industry. It was founded in the late 60s, and it's grown pretty exponentially since then. So there's been a 90% growth in production by volume between 1997 and 2017. And the industry has ambitious growth targets. It's continually scoping new production sites in Scotland. There are about 6, or there are exactly 6 major companies operating in Scotland at the moment, which I've listed on the screen. And for a couple of these companies, Maui, Grieg and Cook Aquaculture, their Scottish productions represent one part of a much larger global portfolio. Aquaculture in Scotland produces salmon for markets including UK retail, the restaurant trade, food service, but also a lot of the salmon goes to export markets in France, the US and East Asia. So it's very much a global industry. So Farmed salmon is often marketed in a certain way, which I think we're all familiar with from seeing these products on our supermarket shelves. It's often marketed as a very healthy food and as a food that's somehow linked to the pristine and beautiful natural environment where it's grown. And it's marketed often as a sustainable food. So here we have the words of the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation, the industry body in Scotland. Scottish salmon is not only a fantastic, healthy food, it is also a responsible way for people to get the high quality protein and omega-3 oils required as part of a balanced diet. And what Feedback set out to do 2 years ago was to understand, does this portrayal match the reality of the industry? And in particular in relation to feed. The reason we took a focus on feed is that we're a food systems organisation and we take a global systems lens to answering questions like these. And through that lens, we could see that feed is salmon farming's greatest global rather than local impact. It's the industry's greatest greenhouse gas emissions contribution, and it's also its heaviest impact on land and ocean resources globally. So what are farmed salmon actually fed? The principal ingredient that we're concerned with in our research are the marine ingredients, which are fish oil and fish meal, made from wild-caught forage fish. More about those fish in a little bit. And I want to draw your attention in particular to fish oil, which is the ingredient that's responsible for the omega-3 content of farmed salmon, which, as we've seen from that quote from the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation, is a key feature of how the industry likes to promote its product. It's important to know that 90% of the fish used to make fish meal and fish oil, those ingredients for all sorts of industries, not just aquaculture, come from food grade or prime food grade fish, i.e. fish that could be food for people. And farmed salmon are also fed plant ingredients such as soy and rapeseed oil. So those forage fish are just a quick introduction for anyone who hasn't heard the term before. Forage fish are small, often oily fish, ocean-going fish. There are some of the species that are used by the industry listed there: sprat, sardinella, herring. And they're called forage fish because they're prey for larger fish and for marine mammals. So they play a crucial role in transferring nutrients up the ocean food web. And as a result, experts recommend a highly precautionary approach to managing forage fish populations and an ecosystems-based approach. How much wild fish actually goes into the Scottish salmon industry? We published a report last year which showed that around 460,000 tonnes of wild fish were used per year to make fish oil to feed Scottish salmon. To give some sense of scale, 460,000 tonnes is roughly equivalent to the amount of seafood purchased by adults in the UK over the course of a year, so it's no insignificant amount of fish. And it's important to note that the amount of fish oil, the proportion of fish oil below which it seems that further reductions might affect the health of the fish or the omega-3 content of the end product. I'm just going to stop my video. I'm being told my internet connection is unstable. So why do we keep banging on about omega-3 and fish oil? So partly because the micronutrient content of fish is one of the reasons that we're told to eat it so often. The NHS recommends that we eat 2 portions of fish a week and that one of those portions should be an oily fish. And that's because of the micronutrients in fish, primarily omega-3, iodine, vitamin D, and a couple of other key vitamins and minerals. And the question that we set out to ask was, is farmed salmon an effective way to meet this nutritional need? There's an argument that we should be eating more fish, but should those micronutrients be coming from farmed salmon, as the industry would have us believe? And to answer that question, we did some modelling that we're going to talk through in just a moment. comparing the total micronutrients available from Scottish farmed salmon with the micronutrients provided in marine feed ingredients. Just a quick note, we're talking a lot here about micronutrients, but not very much about protein. So a note on protein. We didn't look at protein production as a benefit or an output or a key output of the farmed salmon industry. And that's because when we look at the protein in salmon feed, we see that farmed salmon are fed other protein ingredients as well as the marine ingredients, so like soy, as I've already mentioned. And when you compare all the salmon that goes into salmon diets with the protein that comes out in the form of a final product, we find that for every 100 grams that goes in, only about 28 grams ends up on our plates. So from the perspective of protein, it would be better to eat the plant proteins and fish proteins in the salmon diets ourselves rather than route those nutrients through salmon. And this infographic shows that broader principle that many of you will be familiar with, that from a greenhouse gas emission and a land use perspective, it's almost always better to eat plant-based sources of protein. That's from the 2018 study. So I'm going to hand over now to Christina to explain how our modelling worked.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm going to leave my video off as well because I worry about the internet. So turning to our model, the question we were looking at is it efficient from a micronutrient perspective to feed wild fish to farmed salmon? This was following on from our first report, which Jess mentioned. That report showed that the Scottish farmed salmon industry uses 460,000 tonnes of wild fish for feed every year. Essentially, we examined if it's better from a micronutrient perspective to feed that fish to salmon or to eat the fish directly. We found overall that spreading consumption across many species and eating them directly, rather than using them to feed salmon, allows us to significantly reduce the amount of each species of fish caught while still giving us the same nutritional component and fulfilling our nutritional needs. So how did we come to this conclusion? We had three scenarios. So the first one is business as usual. So in this scenario, we take the 460,000 tonnes of wild fish and we turn it into fish oil and fish meal to produce salmon. For farmed salmon, you need more fish oil than fish meal. But when you make fish oil, you get some leftover fish meal. So in this model, we assumed that all of the leftover fish meal was used to farm prawns. Just a note that we don't think that that is like the optimal situation. That's just what we had the best data for. So we assumed it could also be used to go to pigs or chickens or something else. But in this model, we assumed it went to farm prawns. In this business as usual scenario, we've assumed based on available public figures that around a third of the fish for the fish oil needed will come from byproducts. So these include things like fish heads and fish trimmings. And then the rest is coming, so this bigger one above that is coming from whole wild caught fish such as sprat and herring, blue whiting anchovies, and as Jess already mentioned, 90% of that fish is edible. And then the feed is also comprised of plant ingredients, which is what you see at the bottom half here. So stuff like wheat, soy, and peas, which is also edible. So in this scenario, we produce 179,000 tonnes of salmon and 399,000 tonnes of prawns. So that's what you see at the end here. That's what we end up with. In this scenario, you get one portion of Scottish farmed salmon per person a week and about 300 grams of prawns. Assuming we use this to meet our NHS recommended amounts, we would access about 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids, which is enough to meet our weekly recommended allowance. So is that good? Well, the two key problems with this approach is from a nutritional perspective, the sum of micronutrients from wild fish going into the fish oil and fish meal is larger than the amount that ends up on our plates. So that's an inefficient use of those micronutrients. And then from a sustainability perspective, we're using a lot of wild caught fish, and this is particularly important in the context of 93% of fish stocks being in danger of disappearing. So then the next scenario, which we refer to as, oh yeah, so just to say, this is what scenario A looks like. Sorry, just salmon and prawns, quite bland, the same color, not exciting. So then we looked at scenario B, which is just using byproducts for feed. So in this scenario, we imagine that no whole wild-caught fish was used for salmon feed, and the feed was exclusively fed from byproducts. So this then would lead to scaled down salmon production. As I mentioned earlier, based on available figures, about 1/3 of the fish oil for Scottish salmon comes from byproducts. So the industry will be at 1/3 of the current size. So you can go to the next slide, Jess. So then what we had to figure out was, in order to get the same nutritional output, how much of the wild fish that was previously being fed to salmon would we have to eat directly? So we figured out that we would have to eat 187,000 tons of stuff like sprat, capelin, herring. But that, on the plus side, means that we get to leave 59% of that fish in the sea. And then also from the plant ingredient perspective, we only need a small bit of the plant ingredients now. So we get to liberate some of that for us to consume it, but also for it to stay in the ground, so it would reduce things like deforestation. And with this, you end up with a much more varied plate at the end. So you still have some salmon, you still have some prawns, but you have a bigger variety of fish, and you still get a very similar nutritional output. So yeah, so you get, to get the same nutritional output as the business as usual, you need to consume 40% of that fish, but as I said, 59% get to stay in the sea, and we've liberated some of that plant protein. So next slide. So it looks more like this. So you get a more variety, and you also get to leave fish in the sea and more plant protein in the ground. So then, oh yeah, that's scenario A again. So scenario C, we then wanted to explore if we could leave more fish in the sea by using unfed aquaculture. Unfed aquaculture includes biovalves such as mussels and oysters and seaweed, and these species do not require any external feed inputs. So in this third scenario, scenario C, we do the exact same as scenario B. So the salmon feed, again, consists only of trimmings and byproducts. But in addition, we assume that everyone will eat a regular portion of farmed mussels. So you can go to the next slide. So yeah, you see again that we eat some portion of the wild fish, but because we're now eating the mussels, which don't require feed, and currently only 3% of global mussel production is being used, we get to leave more wild fish in the sea. So we can leave 77% of wild fish in the sea in this scenario, to get an even more diverse plate at the end, because we have also got mussels on it, and to get the same nutritional output. So next slide. The next slide. Oh, yeah, so this is what scenario C looks like. So very similar to scenario B, but we get the mussels. So then this is the nutritional profiles for each scenario. When we compare the nutritional profiles of the scenarios, you can see that scenario B or C, so those are the ones where no wild fish is being fed to salmon, and you were eating a more diverse seafood diet. They're either equivalent to or they outperform business as usual for all micronutrients, except vitamin D, which you can get from other sources, such as sunshine, which unfortunately is not always readily available here, but also through supplements. And also what's important to note that obviously in both those alternative scenarios, pressure on wild fish stocks is significantly lessened. So this suggests that farmed salmon is not an efficient or environmentally friendly way to get a healthy diet. When we present this findings, the main argument we get from industry is that no one will eat herring and anchovies. And then I guess a response to that is that what we eat is consistently evolving and changing, and that's particularly the case with seafood. So a couple of examples that in 2011, Fernley Whittingstall promoted mackerel consumption on national TV. I'm sure a lot of you saw that use fish fight. And then it went up by 14% in the months thereafter. And also salmon itself was not always so popular. And data from DEFRA shows that purchases of salmon have risen by a massive 550% in the last 50 years. And, you know, maybe that's all organic growth, but I imagine that marketing had a lot to do with that. So in the same way, the food industry has a role in promoting a variety of small oily fish. And that's in line with NHS guidelines as well for us to eat a variety of fish. And particularly with seafood, restaurants and chefs have a role because people in the UK consume more seafood out of home than they do in the home. Maybe not in the current coronavirus situation, but in general. So this shows essentially that our research shows that the way we feed wild fish to salmon is inefficient. And another way in which the salmon industry is wasteful is it has a very high level of mortalities. In 2019, there was a 14% mortality rate for the Scottish salmon industry. To put that in context, if you want to qualify for the UK Red Tractor scheme for chickens, you can have no higher than a 5% mortality rate. So the rate in Scotland is 3 times above that. And in 2019, mortalities represented a waste of around 25,000 tons of wild fish in the form of feed, which is enough to feed 2 million people their weekly portion of oily fish every year. Next slide. So to sum up then our findings on the modelling, that farmed salmon fed on wild fish is an inefficient and environmentally poor way to produce micronutrients for human diets. It would be better to consume a wide variety of small, oily, wild-caught fish alongside increasing our consumption of farmed mussels. Along with, as we said, we would still eat a small quantity of farmed salmon. And I think it's important to point out that variety is key there because we don't want to promote one particular type of fish because when you do that, then that puts too much pressure on that one fish. So the goal is variety. And if we do that, we can access the same level of micronutrients as we do under the current business as usual scenario, while leaving 77% of wild caught fish in the sea that's currently used for salmon feed. So the research suggests there is enough fish in the sea if we manage marine resources sustainably.
Thank you, Christina. I'm getting messages on my screen that my internet connection is unstable, so apologies if I do break up a little bit. Karen, any questions for us from that first section that we should address now?
Yes, maybe this is a good moment. So I'm getting, first of all, Antonio asks whether we will put a recording and a copy of the slides available to people afterwards. I think it sounds like a good idea. I don't know if we have set up to do that. Yeah, great. So then, and then there are a series of questions coming through from Martin Jaffa. First of all, the encouraging people to eat forage fish. I think we are certainly going to be doing that, but we do not want to step away from the challenge that salmon poses. And then there is the question around pet food. A very important question, as well as the issues you are raising, Martin, around fish meal trading and where fish meal goes. In fact, if most fish meal goes to poultry and pigs and fertilizer, then I would challenge IFOS, so that's the Marine Ingredients Organization representing the reduction fishery sector, that their calculations of fish in, fish out ratio are then a little bit not quite as they are represented on their website, if that is the case. In any case, around pet food and where fish meal goes, they are very important issues. We are trying to get to the bottom of it. The challenge is the lack of transparency in the industry. So if you were to be able to point us to publicly available data around the percentage of the market that uses fish meal and fish oil in cat food, for example, then that would be very, very useful, because feedback indeed does want to develop a position on that, but we want to do it in an informed way with the right data. So I think that's what we can answer on that now. I don't know, Jess, Christina, you want to add to that or move on to the next section?
Yeah, I will talk a little bit about pet food in talking about how we can make best use of the micronutrients available in wild fish and whether certification is helping us manage that. So maybe we'll move on and come back to questions at the end. So the second report that we published was about the current industry approach to managing their sustainability concerns. The salmon industry is well aware that there is a problem at the heart of their production model, in that they are a growing industry. And many companies are researching alternative feed ingredients which could replace wild fish, but we haven't yet seen evidence that those ingredients could be used at scale, or that they won't create other sustainability concerns, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. So we're very supportive of alternative feed ingredients, but the evidence needs to be there that they are indeed a positive alternative. So for the moment, what is the industry doing to manage this tension? Last year, we asked all of the companies operating in Scotland to provide transparency on how and where they source their wild fish. I was sorry that only 3 were able to respond in any detail. The companies that did engage are the ones on the right, so Maui, Loch Duart and Grieg Seafood. And we're grateful to those companies for their engagement in our research. And what we saw from these companies' responses and from publicly available information is that all companies in the industry are heavily committed to using certification schemes to assure their customers of the sustainability of the wild fish that they use in feed. But interestingly, we also found that for companies with global operations like Maui, they often apply more stringent requirements to sourcing feed ingredients for their Scottish production than they do for, say, their Norwegian production, which I think is linked to the kind of brand that Scottish salmon farming likes to promote, the kind of pristine, highly sustainable brand image. The main certification schemes that companies use are the Marine Stewardship Council and the Marin Trust, formerly known as the IFO Responsible Standard. And in our report, we do explore some of the academic critiques, in particular of the Marine Stewardship Council, and further issues that impact on the effectiveness of certification schemes, such as what the impact of climate change is going to be on the reliability of fisheries management approaches. However, the issue that I want to turn our attention to, our kind of overarching concern with certification, is that the growing demand for certified feed ingredients created by salmon farming and the legitimacy that this creates for this model of resource use is placing an unsustainable burden on wild fisheries, or increasing the unsustainable burden on wild fisheries. To help explore this, I want to look at a case study from West Africa. So the Scottish salmon industry is growing, as I've said, and there's stiff competition for high quality fish oil, which can deliver salmon that's high in omega-3. And the sardinella fishery is one possible source of high quality fish oil. Sardinella is very rich in omega-3s. Unfortunately, according to the FAO, this region is also the 4th most unsustainably fished area worldwide, and 40% of fisheries in the region are biologically unsustainable. Sardinella is also a significant source of protein and micronutrients for the people who actually live in this region, particularly in Senegal and further south, less so in Mauritania or Morocco. And 3 major companies, the feed companies Biomar and Iwas Cargill and Maui, the salmon company, all told us that they sourced some fish oil from Mauritania. And their argument to us is that by engaging in this market, even though they know that standards are low overall and that the fisheries have some problems, that by engaging there, they can raise standards. They can create demand for higher standards by encouraging their suppliers to move towards certification. However, our concern is, does the fact that a small number of suppliers are seeking a new certified source of high quality fish oil make a wider, quite precarious fishery likely to be sustainable long term? It's not clear to us that it does. It may open a new market for them, but I'm not sure about the long-term sustainability guarantees. And there's a further issue with a kind of gamification of certification standards. So Maui told us that while they buy fish oil from Mauritania, they don't use it in Scotland because of these higher sustainability standards there. but they do use it elsewhere, for example in Norway. So effectively they prioritise ingredients with the higher sustainability standards for the market where this is most meaningful in terms of their market positioning, whilst continuing to use these lower standard ingredients elsewhere in the supply chain. So effectively they're still acting as a driver of demand for fish taken from precarious and vulnerable fisheries, where if these fisheries collapse, there could be a very dangerous and very long-term impact on the lives and livelihoods and nutrition of people living in the region. And we've called this dynamic supply chain privilege in our reports. And then there's another issue I want to turn to, which is of access to micronutrients. Who is eating what? Which is a question that certification does not address. And in fact, by certifying fisheries in regions where fish could play a very important part in local nutrition, we end up privileging these nutrients instead for global commodities markets, effectively. By certifying these fisheries, we reclassify fish away from being a human food and towards being a feed ingredient. And we transfer nutrients from where they generate the most human value to where they generate the most financial value. In simple terms, we take fish from one part of the world where they could be eaten by people to feed them to farmed salmon intended for a much wealthier global market. And as a result of this dynamic and of our concerns about certification, we do not support the use of certification for any fish caught for use as feed, either in agriculture or aquaculture, or indeed in pet food, which is another major market that we're currently investigating and need to know more about. And alongside the nutritional modelling that Christina explained, this leads us to recommend that for salmon farming at least, reduction fisheries should not form part of the feed supply chain. And as we previously argued, that the industry should solely meet its fish oil and fish meal needs from byproducts rather than from whole caught fish. So I guess there's a final bigger question just before we wrap up, which is, if we don't think that reduction fisheries, which are the fisheries used to catch fish to make fish oil and fish meal, if we don't think they should be certified, is there a role at all for these sorts of fisheries in a sustainable food system? And in fact, I think we would argue that no, there isn't, and that all available nutrients in fish should be consumed in the way that makes best use of those nutrients, which is directly by people, rather than routing them through salmon. Our research is on farmed salmon, so this may not be the case for other aquaculture species. However, it's important to note that salmon is actually one of the more efficient farmed fish at converting feed ingredients into biomass. However, that doesn't make it more efficient than eating those ingredients or those nutrients directly. But yes, we would say then we need further research on other aquaculture species. So just a quick overview of the recommendations in our reports, or a sort of simplified version of them. There's some much longer recommendations in the reports themselves. So we argue that certification schemes should not cover reduction fisheries for marine ingredients. We argue that salmon producers should immediately shift to using marine ingredients made solely from byproducts in order to feed their fish. We argue that retailers should commit to phasing out fish meal and fish oil that is not made from byproducts by 2025 in their supply chains, and should also promote a much wider diversity of sustainably caught fish and unfed aquaculture products like mussels. And that regulators should adopt governance programs that are supportive of rebuilding fish populations. And I would also add that there's a need for regulation to ensure that byproducts markets are not distorted by increased demand for feed ingredients. And to chefs and restaurants, we would encourage them at this point to stop selling farmed salmon until whole wild caught fish is removed from their supply chains, and to promote a much wider variety of wild fish and of farmed mussels. So our conclusion is that a seafood industry which supports healthy diets and healthy oceans is possible, but to get there we do need to closely examine our assumptions about how we make the best and most equitable use of the micronutrients that are available to us in the world. And we also need to question our assumptions about what we eat and what we don't eat. As Christina said, farmed salmon only emerged as a popular fish choice in the last 20 to 30 years. And that emergence didn't come about by accident. There are powerful corporate interests to be served by commodifying wild fish from one part of the world and feeding it to salmon that is heavily marketed to consumers in another part of the world. And I think the level of investment in corporate social responsibility that the industry is doing shows that they are aware of their weak spots here. The question is whether they'll go beyond window dressing to addressing the tension at the core of their business model and adopting recommendations like a wholesale shift to byproducts. And I actually just want to go back quickly to zoom in on this picture at the bottom of tartan salmon, which I think is a perfect example of what we're talking about. This is a product from the Scottish Salmon Company, marketed in Japan, playing off the Scottish associations, and as you can see, it says high in omega-3 on the packet. So a product for a luxury market, fed using fish from a faraway country that could be eaten by people. So there we go, that's us for now, and we'd be happy to take some questions. So I think Karen again is going to have a look through the Q&A, and we'll try and field as many as we can in the next sort of between 5 and 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think we've got enough time to go through the questions, sort of starting from the last one actually asked, and then maybe come back to Martin's questions around fish meal if we have time at the end. So the first one, Helen Howard asks, did you model a plant-based scenario? Do you mean by that, Helen, a vegan diet?
I think Helen's muted, so she might find it hard to answer.
Yeah, so if it, yeah, I don't know, do you want to go on that, Jess or Christina?
Yeah, I can answer. We didn't model in this a plant-based scenario because we were looking particularly at the omega-3 issue, which is a reason that salmon is often promoted as like something that we need in our diet. As Jess pointed out earlier, though, we do know you can get protein from a lot of plant-based sources, and at Feedback in general, we do encourage people eating a more plant-based diet, but we think that things like things like small oily fish can play a role in a sustainable diet as well for people who want to eat fish.
Yeah, and just to emphasize, we've spoken to a lot of nutritionists around plant omega-3, like you would get in chia seeds, for example, but that's a third type of omega-3, so a different chemical composition, and it does not bring that same level of kind of benefits in terms of heart disease and other conditions. So this is omega-3 is one of those very few micronutrients that is difficult to get in a vegan diet. But having said that, we just went back to the literature around protein retention, and we know for everything else, especially protein, there is no need to go through fish at all. We can just use plant-based. The next question, Elinor Hammer asks about substituting fish oil with innovations such as algal oil, and I'll just answer this. We can do it quite quickly. So in our report, we look at that. We know that currently it is possible, but it's not yet scalable because it's very expensive. And we know that then actually, whilst it reduces pressures on wild caught fish, it increases greenhouse gas emissions, both because you increase then also your reliance on things like soya that still in Europe majorly needs to be imported from South America on the one hand, and on the other hand, the energy intensity of extracting the algal oil. So we're replacing one problem with another. So we need to really think about that very carefully. Then there is a question from Haven King Nobles asking about individual suffering. If we consume less salmon and more mussels and small fish, wouldn't we end up with more individuals suffering on these farms? So in terms of numbers of individuals, just think about the number of individuals if we left 59% in the fish in the sea in the first place, as we have in our scenario B. Now, in terms of mussels, we haven't thought about individuals. We have taken more like a general ocean health and ecosystem health perspective on that. But there is also the issue of mortalities, and if we're thinking about animal suffering, I don't know, Jess, if you want to just say a bit more again about mortalities there.
Yeah, I guess absolutely, fish welfare is an issue. It's not an issue that Feedback is a specialist in, because we're focused on environmental impacts. but it is something that we take into account. And I think our view would be where you are farming an animal, i.e., it's not a animal whose population is set by natural limits. It's your duty to ensure that you do not farm the animal so intensively that you cause an excess level of mortalities. And as we've seen, mortalities in the salmon industry are running at around 14% last year. So that's fish that die before they're harvested, because I guess the other perspective on welfare would be if you're going to farm an animal, you make very sure that you make use of the nutritional content in that animal rather than wasting it through fish that can't be eaten. I believe Compassion in Wild Farming is doing some more research on the welfare question as well.
Cool. Okay, so more questions have come in the meantime, so we'll go back to those. I'm just looking at them. Yeah, so we need to explain a little more about our position on certification. So Libby Woodhatch asks, assessment and certification in reduction fisheries is driving improved sustainability of fisheries and also in fisheries for direct human consumption where the demand for byproduct is growing. This increases the perceived value of byproduct and results in less wastage. I don't know if you want to go at that, Christina or Jess, or do you want me to have a go?
After you, Karen.
Yeah, the position on certification is that overall the issue is that so certification, and I've had this debate with people of the Fair Trade Foundation, if you're certifying something like organic or fair trade, where theoretically you're trying to make the whole world organic and fair trade, and the volume of production is your limit. Here you have a very different situation where you have a very limited amount of fish within which you're trying to certify, and actually you can't, because you certifying won't actually increase the number of fish that are available in the sea. And we see that the certification bodies take very much an approach of asking the fishery in the area to show a management plan that will demonstrably lead to the recovery of the fish stock in question. And then you get sort of either certification or you're part of a fisheries improvement project. And none of those you can really, this demonstrably bit we would really challenge, because the more detailed case studies in our report show that when you throw climate change into the mix on the one hand, and you throw in fishery quota kind of turf wars across areas of the sea, then it becomes impossible to really plan for that kind of sustainability of that one particular fish in your ecosystem. And so we know that certification from that perspective, when it's driven by market in this very limited supply situation, cannot actually work. And that's why we have the supply chain privilege. We kind of take out the best bits for Scotland, for the Scottish salmon, and the rest goes elsewhere. But in the end, we're all just driving up demand within an overall market. It's quite a complicated kind of issue that we've grappled with for a long time. But looking at it from this limited, there's always going to be a very limited supply. We think certification is a distraction from what should be holistic, government-enforced overall fishery management policies, not certification that is driven by consumer demand. Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like some of these conversations, Libby, we'd love to engage with you in a format where we can have a proper conversation rather than via the chat box. And Martin, we've also been in touch with you. I just want to quickly turn to a question from Sally about the use of krill from the Antarctica, and then we will probably wrap up for the day. Sally, good point. In our first report, we did talk a little bit about krill, and we do have concerns that the certification of krill and the kind of normalization of krill as a feed ingredient has come about based on insufficient science. I believe the survey of Antarctica, on which the krill fisheries are currently based, is from several years ago. And the fact is that we just don't know what the impact of krill fisheries is going to be on a very vulnerable and very important habitat. So I suspect we probably would not be for krill fisheries, but it's not an area that we focused on, in part because of the very vulnerable fisheries for some forms of wild fish that are a more major part of the supply chain. Okay, well, it's 1:45, so to keep to time, I think we're going to wrap up. I'll just return to the slide which has our email addresses on in case anyone wants to get in touch. Right back at the beginning.
Yeah, and as we said earlier as well, we will send around.
Sorry, everyone, this is a bit busy.
As well.
There we go. So it's just our first names at feedbackglobal.org. And just remains to say thank you very much to everyone for attending and for your questions and contributions. We hope you've found this interesting, and please do check out the full reports on our website. Many thanks.